Thank you for being here. Recently, over the last 12 months, or I mean, much longer, but over the last 12 months, we've had a series of devastating floods, particularly in the eastern half of Australia. And one of the noticeable things I was thinking about is that people keep on talking about record-breaking events as 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 year events. And then they happen again 2 or 3 years later. And so this is this sort of weird dialogue we have as if these things are unusual and unexpected. And it produces, in a way, a false sense of security because people think then that's not going to happen again soon. But in fact, they are. And I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, look, let me give you three examples. In 2010, we had some devastating fires and a heat wave, which together killed several hundred people. And those fires in 2010 were of an intensity not projected to occur till the end of the century. We had on the 18th of December 2019, we had the hottest day on record in Australia, where the average temperature across Australia was 41.9 degrees average, which meant that a good bit of the country was touching 50. And that was an event that was projected in the models not to occur till 2040 to 2060. So once again, the reality was ahead of the projections, and constantly we're having inland Australia experience heat waves that are not projected for many decades to come. So these are regular patterns, and obviously they have to do with what I think is an underestimation of the risks. Now, the reason why that may occur is several. The past is no longer a guide to the future. So if you're using historical data, then you're going to be really wrong. Policymakers are using IPCC scenarios, which have in many ways turned out to be, I mean, for example, in sea level rise and so on, have turned out to be too conservative. I actually wrote a piece. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists did a special journal issue on tipping points. And they asked me to do a thing on scientific reticence, perhaps because I wasn't a scientist and I could say things that others couldn't. But I mean, there are a number of reasons for this. And in fact, as well, as Michael Mann pointed out, with some of the extreme heat in Europe, that there were elements of the climate system that up till now, I mean, Rossby waves and blocking systems that hadn't been well understood. So, there are a number of reasons for these projections of extreme events to be too conservative, but it does leave policymakers. Our government is supposed to be releasing a climate risk assessment and has it on hold, and we fear that it will be too conservative. And I mean, perhaps the greatest example of this is, can I say, the debate, the dispute, the circumstances surrounding the 1.5 degree target and actuality. As you know, in 2023, the world hit 1.5, and people said flabbergasted, unexpected, can't altogether be explained. We don't quite know what's going on. Jim Hansen had a different view. He said, "I know what this is. This is largely aerosols," and most of those scientists said in 2023, well, of course, it won't be as hot in 2024 because the El Nino will fade, and then 2024 was 1.6. Which was another shock to the system. And the last 24 months, the running average over 24 months to April this year was 1.6. And now the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, came out and said there's a 70% chance that the years 2025 to 2029 will be greater than 1.5. So, I mean, I am saying, I mean, even if you look at the data, the last 5 years average is 1.4. I mean, I think for all practical reasons, we're at 1.5 now. And people say to me, no, but the IPCC says, that warming is the average of the last 30 years. And I say, well, yes, if you've got a rising sequence of numbers, then a historical average will be low. So if a sequence of numbers is rising, then the average of the last 30 years will tell you what it was 15 years ago. And so if you want to know what warming is, you should take, if you want a 30-year average, you should take that average, which will take you back 15 years, and then add on the warming over the last 15 years, which is now, as we know, is increased from 0.2 to 0.3 per decade. So you add another 0.45, and you'll get back to 1.5 again. I mean, the reason I say this is, as you know, that the IPCC in their 2018 1.5 report forecast 1.5 between 2030 and 2052 with a midpoint of 2040. And as I understand it, policy making and, for example, the 2015 Paris Agreement on 1.5 to 2 and the notorious carbon budgets associated with it were based on 1.5 by 2040. And, you know, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 by 2050. That's the policy making paradigm. And the simple point I made, which I wrote in a piece in the Canberra Times, which is our national capitals paper, on Monday of this week, is that if we are really at 1.5 now, and it was projected for 2040, and that's the basis on which policy is being made, then we have just lost 15 years from the emissions reduction timetable. And this is a conversation that I can find nobody in Australia wants to have. Not amongst the government, not amongst NGOs. It's something to me that is so obvious that it shouldn't have to be said, but it's just is one of those things that can't be talked about. So, I mean, this is another example of that faster than forecast stuff that Jason Box talked a lot about in relation to Greenland. And I mean, as you know, I mean, in the end, I mean, people like Katharine Hayhoe said, you know, and I quote, "This is happening at a much faster rate than ever documented in the past. If anything, we are much more likely to underestimate the impacts of those changes on human society than overestimate them." So, I mean, I think this is now a really big problem for us, but also for governments in how they project future warming and what is necessary, whether it be resilience and adaptation measures or whether it be emission reduction measures. That I spent a lot of time working with a guy called Ian Dunlop, who was a former, from the Club of Rome, who was a former senior oil executive. And he, for many years, said to me, you know, he says, when risks are existential, the most important thing is to understand what is the plausible high-end scenario and prepare for it. And I mean, and that's the problem that we see. If you say, oh, look, an average flood will be 5 meters, but the plausible high end is 7, it's the 7 that you should plan for, not the 5. So I think there's a problem right through adaptation planning and resilience planning in this underestimation of the risks. In the paper for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and I can send it to Dennis or Ron because I think it's behind a paywall, I made sort of 6 basic points. The first was the over-reliance on models, which is one thing that Jim Hansen has said for a long time. He says paleodata and observations are as important as models. And you know the problem with models. I mean, they are linear statistical processes dealing with sometimes non-linear events. And they are not perfect, and they do not understand. They do not incorporate everything because we don't know them all. I mean, the Rossby waves destabilization, the jet stream is a classic example. I mean, we had another one recently in regard to the 1.5 warming, where people were still scratching their head about why there'd been this sharp uptake in warming, and Hansen had talked about this. He said the reduction of aerosols is not just that, but it's going to reduce the cloud cover. And in fact, you know, a couple of papers come out saying, yes, at this time the cloud cover did reduce. And I don't think that is incorporated in models at the moment. Anyway, so I mean, it's just natural that models are not perfect and science is not perfect. And so they're conservative. The second thing that John Schellenhuber talked about in a 40 did report of ours was a sort of what he called a quantification fetish. If you can't put a number on it, then it's not going to be talked about, and that's particularly a problem with integrated assessment models, for example, which try to put a value on future damage in order to have a cost benefit equation. And economists and everybody is now saying the future is so radically uncertain, and translating physical effects into social effects, into economic effects, is so non-linear that you actually can't put a value on the damage. And I think that's true. I mean, it's like you can't put a value on the damage of dropping an atom bomb on half the world. It's not possible. It's beyond it. And Schellnhuber said this is quantification fetish, and he also said, and it's a very simple thing. He said, too much of the science is concerned about the probabilities. That is, 95 to 90% chance of it being X, but the middle figure is X. He said, it's not the probabilities we need to worry about, it's the possibilities. It's the things on the edge. So, if the high-end plausible worst-case scenarios are the most damaging, then that's where our attention should be. And I don't think, certainly the IPCC reports don't do that. The fourth point is that the IPCC is not simply a science forum, it's a science and politics forum. It's where science and politics collide for all the reasons that including the fact that ambassadors from 190 odd countries, including petrostates, appoint the coordinating authors. And a leading international scientist said to me, if you want to understand why there's a problem with the IPCC, he says, have a look who gets appointed as the authors. I mean, when you've got people like Toll doing the economic stuff, you've got a problem, and I don't think it's appreciated. I mean, I think most punters and unfortunately too many NGOs would see the IPCC as a science organisation rather than a mediation of science and politics. And of course, groupthink and where funding points research. I mean, it's interesting that in 2015, the idea of 1.5 was put on the agenda in Paris, and until 2015, there had been almost no research on 1.5. It had all been on 2 and 3. And after Paris, suddenly governments put a whole lot of money into 1.5 research because it had been put on the political agenda. So I think that's a really clear case of science following politics in terms of the emphasis of where the money goes. So anyway, that paper's there and it can be circulated. The other thing that happened this year is as you know, there's been a lot of literature out there saying that 1.5 is not a safe boundary for large Earth systems. I mean, Eric Rignow in 2014 said West Antarctic is in big trouble, and we asked him and said, well, when do you think that sort of, now you've seen it, when you think that was triggered? And he said, well, I think you'd need to be under 0.5 degree to really keep West Antarctica stable. And obviously we have the problem of coral reefs in a death spiral. So we've known that. In that issue of Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, there was a really good interview on Amazon, on the Amazon, the fate of the Amazon, which was really brutal. But this year we've seen 2 papers. The first said there was a significant risk of large Amazon dieback at 1.5 or more. And another one warned that 1.5 is too high for polar ice sheets. So, I mean, I think the evidence grows that 1.5 never was a safe target, which is something that David King, who had a bit to do with the 1.5 process in Paris, said afterwards. He said, at the time I thought 1.5 was okay, but I soon realised it wasn't. So, I mean, this is the great dilemma, which leads us to an interventions debate, is that we are now practically at 1.5. And I don't want to say that because it's a great thing, but I really think we are. I think we are at 1.5, and we have more and more evidence 1.5 is not stable for systems. And you might remember when Will Steffen and his colleagues did the Hothouse Earth paper, I think in 2018, in there they said, and he said afterwards, and they said, well, where's this trigger point for Hothouse Earth? And he said, well, it could be as low as 1.5 to 2. So we don't know, but if you're precautionary, you'd say, we're walking pretty close to the gates of hell now. that's that's sort of my feeling. Um, so that's where we are. We've lost 15 years. What's going to happen? Well, it's pretty obviously going to go to 3 degrees or more. We've got continuing high emissions. The UN Environment Programme says they'll decline only slowly, perhaps only by 10 or 20% by 2050. We've got decreasing sulfate emissions, so that short-term cooling impact is decreasing. We've got decreased reflectivity as a consequence and for other reasons, and we don't need less sea ice, but also less low clouds. You've got carbon stores becoming carbon sources. There have been permafrost, Amazon, boreal forest, warmer wildfires. I mean, the fires in Canada and their emissions are really, I mean, that's astounding data. And perhaps the ocean heat sink becoming less efficient. So we are heading towards 3 degrees. I mean, there was a survey in Science a few years ago of a whole of IPCC scientists said, where do you think we're going? And 60% said 3 degrees or more. So I don't think that's rocket science. What does that mean? Well, as you know, every 1 degree of warming in the end produces 10 to 20 meters of sea level rise. Something I tell policymakers often, and they simply don't believe it. You know, the timing is up in the air, but Jim Hansen said he'd bet $1,000 to a donut that his 5 meters this century was closer than the IPCC at half a meter. You're going to have extreme heat, near unlivable heat, and I'll show a couple of images. And the dry subtropics will dry out and desertify, with catastrophic impacts on food and water, which is really the basis of this chain. So, in 2021, Chatham House did a climate risk assessment. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It is really well communicated. It's really clear. It's big picture, and it's an astounding piece of work. And they basically said, unless emissions drop sharply before 2030, and I think there's no chance of that, then by the period 2040, 2050, and this is Chatham House, I mean, the UK government funds this, they said by 2040, 50, there will be a 30% drop in crop yields by mid-century. But food demand, because more middle classes in Asia in particular, will be up 50%. 1/3 of cropland will be affected by severe drought each year, and cascading impacts would drive political instability, I quote, drive political instability and greater national insecurity and fuel regional and international conflict. And then an even more out there report was released, I think, in January this year by the UK actuaries and the University of Exeter. It's called Planetary Solvency, and it says at 3 degrees, and I think this might be pushing the envelope a bit, but good luck for them for generating it. At 3 degrees, GDP losses would be equal or greater than 50%. Human mortality would be equal to or greater than 50%. There will be breakdown of critical eco and earth systems, high levels of extinction of higher order life, and significant socio-political fragmentation worldwide and/or state failure, with rapid, enduring, and significant loss of capital and systems identity, which I think is a really polite way of saying collapse. So let me just show a couple of slides. Ron asked me to, I think I'd used them before because these sort of do illustrate in a fairly graphic way. So let me just share this for you. So just to talk about 3 degrees, because we've used this in Australia. I did some work with some retired military officers, and we showed this to the government, and they still haven't recovered. So this is a really well-known paper called Quantifying the Human Cost of Global Warming. And this was their work on what they called a near unlivable zone at 2.7 degrees. Now, I mean, 2.7 is what? Somewhere between 2050 and 2060? Probably. I mean, at the present rate of 0.3 a decade, maybe 2060. And they defined that red area as those parts of the world that will exhibit levels of heat beyond that ever experienced in human history. MAT, mean average temperature greater than 29, resulting in near unlivable conditions currently found on only 0.8% of the planet's surface, mainly in the Sahara. And given that we're in Australia, and then there was work at the beginning of this year from King's College saying, if we hit 2 degrees, particularly for people over 60, a third of the planet's land mass would not be livable because of vulnerable heat for older people. And if you then look at that area, more particularly in Australia, I mean, not only is it the northern third of Australia, but this is India, Pakistan, a good bit of Afghanistan, most of Indonesia, parts of the Philippines, and a good bit of Thailand and Malaysia. Now, that conservatively is 2 billion people. 2 billion people, and what they're saying at 2.7 degrees, not even 3, 2 billion people in this part of the world will be subject to near unlivable heat. That is, you will not be able to survive the heat extremes unless you've got basically air conditioning, I guess. And unless you've got an air-conditioned tractor, you won't be able to farm either. And then there was some data this year. The one on the right, I'm not going to talk about AMOC, but this was data on sort of 2.5 to 3 degrees and a slowdown of AMOC. And the map shows the decrease in wheat, suitability for wheat around the world. I think it's once again it's 2.7, and you can see in the major wheat growing areas whether it's Australia, the US, Central Europe, parts of China, it's in the 60 to 100% decrease. And similarly, the chart on the left for 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 shows the decrease in crop yields, which are really severe. So that's a little bit of a look at that. I wanted just to make one other point, which doesn't come up in the discussion very often. As you know, Earth cycles basically between a period of interglacials, which we have been in, and why is it doing that? Don't want that. And glacials down the bottom, basically between 180 and 280 parts per million, and so they're both points of system stability. The top and bottom end. The system doesn't tend to sit in the middle, but it peaks between those two. And obviously now we are way up here in terms of CO2. And I remember a long time ago, Jim Hansen said, well, look, if you get to 1.5 degrees, you're probably not at a point of system stability. Because, and we can see that now, there's a whole lot of carbon stores which are in a non-stable state and are going to, I mean, that's the hothouse Earth scenario, even, a mild version of it to drive us somewhere faster. So what I thought, I was trying to explain this to some people, is that we've got a sort of a stability at 1.8, we've got stability at 180, we've got stability at 280. In between that is a point of system instability. We are now in another point of system instability. If you stop now, the system would not stop where it is, either in terms of temperature or of CO2. I mean, you look at the wildfires, you look at the permafrost, you look at the Amazon, I mean, there's a whole lot more carbon going to be released. And so the conclusion, and this comes to the last little bit of the talk, which is about climate interventions. My conclusion was that where we now is not a point of system stability, and we actually have a choice. And the choice is cool the system back to system stability or warm to the point of the next point of system stability. And I mean, to me, this is the most significant argument for climate interventions. I mean, just like we've got to smash up this illusion that we've got 15 years to 1.5 when we've got 0 years, we have to educate people as to why the present circumstances are not stable. So finally, I don't know where I got this graph from. You probably all use it for years. But in case you haven't, this is a graph we use to try and argue the case for cooling. which is to say the black line's the path. This dotted line is the danger level for cascading impacts. I mean, whether that's CO2 or impacts or temperature doesn't really matter. I mean, I'd say, we're above that line now. That fast emissions reduction will bend the curve, but it's not going to stop for further warming. That drawdown will bend the curve down, but drawdown is not a fast process. I mean, even if you had it full bore, it would take several decades for it to really have that sort of effect. And therefore, in order to reduce the lid and keep under that dotted line, you need active cooling until those other processes are underway. So that's just my simpleton's version of the case for intervention. So let me just finish. Ron asked me to say a few things about this. And I see Mike McCracken's on the line, so I'm going to steal some of his ideas. Mike wrote a paper a few years ago, which I think was really influential on me, and I mean, because we have this debate about SAI and its efficacy and so on, and Mike said we have to act sooner rather than later, because as warming intensifies, it's going to be more difficult for SAI to be efficacious. It's easier to cool a system from one or 1.5 than it is, and it may not be possible to cool it from 3 because what you require to do is so much. So this is a case for near-term action rather than long-term action. And the second thing he said, which is so obvious, is that the critics of SAI and interventions compare what those interventions might do with the status quo. They don't compare it with the case if you don't act. So they're saying, oh, well, we've got 1.5 or we've got interventions. But that's not true. What we've got is 3 to 4 or interventions. So, Mike, thank you. I found that very valuable. I mean, talking to some people in Europe recently, they tell me that marine cloud brightening research is not going all that great. I mean, it was always a regional thing, but I mean, I think we really are back to SAI as the main game. I mean, John Moore's doing work on physical barriers for glaciers and so on, which is good. And so the point I come to when I argue this is where people get on the high horses and say, oh, we shouldn't have human intervention in nature. And I go, well, it's a bit late for that. But to ask people a really simple question, given the choices, what is the least worst option? And that's sort of that's where I come to the absolute need for cooling intervention. What is the least worst option? Do you want 3 or more, which is where we're absolutely heading, or do you want to try and pull it back? Do you want coral reefs? Do you want Antarctica? Do you want Arctic glaciers? Do you want the Amazon? Or are you prepared to let them go and sit on your moral high horse? So I think the least worst option argument is important. The only other 2 things I want to say is that I see there's a lot of NGOs and a lot of debate about intervention governance. A huge amount. And okay, that's fine up to a certain point, but I worry whether a lot of that stuff is just a ruse for delay. It worries me that some of it may not be what it seems to be. And the final thing is, I mean, for people who've read Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which starts off in a massive heat wave in India, which kills so many people, the Indian government just decides to start doing aerosol sulfates, is to say that, and I don't think this is a conversation that anyone wants to have, if things get bad enough, players will act whether there is governance or not. I mean, it would be better but it's, I mean, whether it's India or China, I mean, if you look at China, China has got a weather modification program involving tens of thousands of people now. I mean, that's one reason John Moore works with people in China, because that's where the money and the thought is. And, China's had a long-term sort of weather modification program to try and redirect moisture from the Himalayan plateau north to that the area in the north of China which has been desertifying. So in terms of interventions, my simple points are: one, it is the least worst option. It is necessary. It's the least worst option. Mike's point about sooner rather than later, and if you get too tied up in governance, you might end up in a black hole. And thanks very much. I think that's half an hour, which is what I promised.
Oh, thank you so much, David. You're speaking to a group that is actually an action coalition, and we are, in fact, trying valiantly to break that scientific reticence bound. And I just wanted to let you know, David, that currently we're working with the Overshoot Commission to mobilize a coalition of the most vulnerable climate countries to a new climate restoration plan, to support it, to champion a new plan which would include the triad of emissions reduction, greenhouse gas removals, and SRM. And, given what you've said today, I'd like to ask you one question. How could we work more closely with you to expand this awareness of the urgency and driving policymakers in Australia and beyond to the kind of action we need to create such a plan and deploy it as soon as possible? I'd like you to reflect on that for a few moments, and then we'll turn it over to the group for more questions and discussion.
Well, I mean, I'm not an SRM expert by any stretch of the imagination. I sort of try and write and communicate across a very broad field of risk and climate and security and tipping points and reticence and so on. I mean, we wrote a book, some of you might know, back in 2008, which made the case for climate intervention. So, I mean, sort of, I've understood this for a long time. I think, I mean, if I look at Australia, I think there is profound ignorance. I mean, I think there is very little understanding of the scientific research, and I struggle to understand all the research on SAI because there is just so much of it. And I think it would be a really good service for somebody to do a literature review, or even a 5-10 page summary, honest summary of where we are on SAI research. I mean, just one, this space between activism and pure research of having the communications tools. I mean, I've said this to several people from climate intervention NGOs who've talked to me. I said, just give us a really ready to read, non-technical, for the punters, for ministerial advisors on that. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't think that the case for intervention has been made all that well. I mean, I haven't heard Mike's points made all that broadly, and I haven't heard the least worst option case made all that well. I mean, people say, "Oh, we should do this because this is good." Well, that's not going to run. I mean, we've got to be honest. We've got to be pragmatic. Yes, there are risks, but there are bigger risks and smaller risks. So that's the second thing. So I don't think we've either got a really good package to communicate the technical possibilities, nor do I think we've really honed down the essential case for intervention all that well.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for that. And let me turn it over to Ron, actually. Ron, you're a little late, so we got started, but would you want to manage the Q&A from here on out?
Dennis, I'm sorry, it's really loud here. I'm in a Starbucks. I'm on the road, so if you could keep on moderating, that would be great. When I turn my unmute, it just gets, I can hardly hear it.
Okay, very good. Well, will you stay with us though, Ron?
I really apologize.
Yeah, we do have a few hands up. We'll start with Greg, then on to Robert, and then Mike. Greg?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was fascinating and very compelling, even though you're speaking to the converted. But
I knew that.
yeah, but
That's
it's
why
still
that-
it's
that-
still you still made a very compelling case despite all that.
that's why I skipped over a whole lot of basics. I didn't give you any one.
Yeah. That's you. That's the way to do it here in this group. But what I could there's many questions that I would ask you, but one in particular is the you showed a slide showing the I guess the interleaved glacial periods and or interglacial periods and instability periods,
Yeah.
right? And that the Earth has tended to rise, successively to a new equilibrium point. And then you made the very compelling jump to our choice is to cool or to wait for the next higher stability point, and that's really the only choice we have. We can't stop it from going to the next stability point if we don't act. Now, I guess my question is, that's a very compelling argument, but how much buy-in do you see the scientific community having in that? Because I think someone like Housefather, who you're probably familiar with, I doubt he would buy that. So is that a model of the Earth's behavior that has a lot of buy-in within the scientific community, the climate community? That's my question.
Well, when I was just a punter doing other things, and I got interested in climate change in the early 2000s, and the more I read, the more mad I got. And when you might remember in 2005 or 6, the Stern report in the UK came out. Nicholas Stern is this report for the UK government. And like the Garner report he had here, he said, and people don't want to believe this now because he's sort of a bit better than he was. He said, "Well, look," Stern said, we could go for 2 degrees or 3 degrees, but going for 2 degrees would be too economically disruptive. So I think we should go for 3 degrees. This is something that he doesn't like to be reminded of. And the CEO of the leading NGO in Australia wrote an opinion piece saying what a great step forward Stern was. And I just got so mad. I got really, really mad. And I thought, I'm going to start reading this really intensively. And the first person I read everything, was Jim Hansen, which was a great place to start. And, and Jim said, he made this point about system stability, because he gives more emphasis to paleo stuff. So I think, look, you'd have to read his books, but his papers. But I mean, I think he's made this point over and over again about points of stability and points of instability. So I mean, I think there is serious science there. I mean, I think the second thing to point to in terms of the scientific evidence is the Hothouse Earth paper, because I mean, what it's saying is that if you get to 1.5 or 2, which is where we are, the Hothouse Earth paper is saying 1.5 to 2 is a point of system instability. That's its whole point. And if you get to 1.5 or 2, you'll get to Hothouse Earth, not 6 or 7, but 3 or whatever. So I think there is reasonable evidence for this proposition. Mike is probably can be more authoritative than I can on this.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I just add though that Jim Hansen's still an outlier in the scientific community. I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
I understand this, but he keeps on being right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I'm with him, but he's an outlier.
I mean, I actually tracked the debate from 2023 on a little bit between, Michael Mann and Zeki and so on one hand, and Hansen on the other. And you should just watch the evolution of what they said. Because Jim Hansen, before 2023 was saying the system is accelerating, warming is accelerating. And people say, oh, no, too early, not enough data, average over 30 years, all the normal stuff. And over the last 3 or 4 years, I don't think Jim has changed his basic prognosis or analysis at all. He's just kept on saying the same things. The aerosols are larger. There's no satellites to measure of them. They're under-measured in the IPCC. It's not just the aerosols, it's the impact they have on clouds. Whereas on the other side, if you look at, Zeke and Michael Mann, they say, oh, 2023, this is an exception that will come back down. And then, oh, whoops, well, maybe it won't. And then, by middle of 2024, they're going, oh, maybe it's a bit different. And yeah, look, and when Jim had said warming has increased 50% from 0.18, 0.2 per decade to 0.3 or more, it might be 0.35, we don't know. They say, oh, no. And now they're saying, oh, now there are peer-reviewed papers saying it's accelerated. So yes, I mean, well, is Jim an outlier? No, I mean, he's just at one end of the risk spectrum, and it's the high end where the reality is.
Yeah. I mean, I almost get the impression that
we need to give others a chance to ask.
I was just going to say, I think Mann is actually laying the ground to embrace cooling slowly.
Yeah, he's shifting.
Yeah, he is. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Robert and then Mike.
Thanks so much, David. Superb presentation. A couple of points that you made that I think deserve a bit more discussion, especially your call for a least worst option. And so analysing what that might entail is something that's really key. My sense over the years, 20 years or so that I've been studying this topic, is now that the moral corruption is on both sides. That is, the idea that we can address climate change through emission reduction alone, to me, it's a deeply corrupt claim because there is such simple evidence, as you explained, and as you said, no one's willing to discuss it. And this is because they say, oh, it's those on the other side, it's the fossil fuel users who are evil and corrupt. Meanwhile, you've got this whole community around President Trump, around the Murdoch press, that says, oh no, we're good, we're the good side, it's the other side who's evil and morally corrupt. And so I suppose some humility on both sides to address that moral problem of, as you said, we're looking at coral reefs, we're looking at the Amazon as mass extinction. And so this call that you made for a simple SAI summary, it's something that I proposed to the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party in Canberra said, yes, let's do that. And but they were unable to get leadership engagement. So what I'm interested in is how this least worst option can be discussed. And so I had an article published in The Hill last week calling for an albedo accord. And so just saying, let's just focus narrowly on albedo and as something that can actually cool the earth, and accept that the agenda that we've accepted so far, that we're going to cool the earth through decarbonisation and carbon and greenhouse gas removal. That's a slower agenda, but we need a fast agenda, which is albedo.
Look, all I can say is, and towards the end of last year, I wrote quite a long report called Collision Course, which is partly what we talked about today, and then it has sort of a section in about politics. And I mean, the simple matter is that the global elite are committed to a business as usual response. It is now clear that climate change, more than anything else, requires large-scale, substantial government intervention to correct the largest market failure of all time. I mean, you can call it the war economy, you can talk it as the sort of interventions governments made during COVID, during pandemics, to actually lead. But the market and the elite are insistent that markets can price the risks, which they can't. And as long as we have this market first, no disruption model, which I think because it's not just the fossil fuel industry. It's the whole of the market economy is wedded to low intervention. The market will resolve the problems, and to me that's the obstacle. In terms of how to engage with intervention research, for example, Robert, in Australia, and I started a little bit of work on this. Australia claims a good bit of Antarctica. I mean, a lot of countries do, and there's actually, there is an agreement about Antarctica, about what's done and what's not done there, and you can't test nuclear weapons there, and you're supposed to behave yourself. I mean, Australia has responsibility under their Antarctic Treaty, as all the countries do, to protect Antarctica. So, I mean, I think that would be an interesting approach to the Australian government, which I've actually talked to some of the independents in the Parliament about what protection for Antarctica means, because, and it's the same in the Arctic, or it's the same for the Amazon. I mean, what does protection mean in practical terms for your government, given you claim this territory? And that has to lead to interventions.
I would say, David, that looking at the market economy, where are the commercial incentives for cooling? And I would say the insurance industry, the agriculture industry, the tourism industry stand out as major industries. It really should be funding cooling and cooling research. But my sense is that they won't do it, partly because of the dominance of the emission reduction alone agenda. And so targeting those industries, I would see as an essential path.
Yeah, look, the other thing I can just say, I don't know if it's the same in North America, but here the mainstream advocacy NGOs are not our friends on interventions. They're the problem.
Yeah.
And I wear away at them a bit, but I mean, you need allies, and they're ones that should be knocked off. I mean, they won't debate this. They won't come out in public. They won't have a sword fight in the middle of the field because they lose. But I mean, they're a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have the same problem in the U.S. Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you, Robert. Mike, your reactions to David and your question?
Well, I think his point about finding a rationale for taking action other than just make the climate right is an important one, and is what I've been thinking about. I think that I'm more and more thinking that the prevailing view comes from sort of an elite perspective of people who live in developed countries that have air conditioning, and so they don't think about others. And so the rationale I would put forth as a suggestion is to try and say, maintain the plausibility of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen, as your sort of visual showed, there's a potential for 2 billion people to start becoming refugees headed toward mid-latitudes. And that just isn't understood. And so if you make Sustainable Development Goals the rationale for it, we actually have an international governance system all set up for that. Yeah. It used to be called the Sustainable Development Commission. If you go back to 2005 or 6, they actually asked for a study to be done. They asked Sigma Xi, which is an honor society, and then the UN Foundation later joined. But they said, we're not happy with the IPCC reports because the IPCC reports say, if this, then that, if this, then that. And they asked us, well, what should we do? Well, scientists don't like to deal with the word should and everything. It has other, implications involved. And so what we instead did, and it was a panel with John Holdren before he became science advisor for Obama. It had Rosina Bierbaum, and then I did the climate, but it was then international, had Schnellhuber or whatever, and some of the others on it. Would say, well, if this is where you want to get, this is what you have to do. And so if we really say that what we want to do is preserve the Sustainable Development Goals and try and make it so we don't generate 2 billion environmental refugees, we have to do intervention. I mean, I just don't think there is any other way. And I think these people who are, objecting are often from mid-latitude countries and just not thinking about it. But I'm having my debates with them. I don't know if, so anyway, What I want to say and sort of ask a question about is the other thing is that there's this notion that if you're going to go to intervention, you have to plan out into the future indefinitely or something like that. And you do sulfate indefinitely or something. And it seems to me we have to get past that. Sulfate or equivalent in the stratosphere is something that we can do best now. We can start in the polar stratosphere and you do it for a while. But if you think a few decades ahead, it wouldn't be surprising if the capabilities that are developing in space came up with space mirrors, or at least a Fresnel lens that sort of deflects solar radiation, which would be presumably have less harmful effects by having less diffuse radiation or something. And so I think we have to get thinking about what it would be over time. It's not just lay out what the present status is, but give a sense of what could happen, what approaches we might go to as time develops. And so I'm just sort of curious about your views on trying to put forth and make that argument. Can we, I don't know if the Commission on Sustainable Development is mostly developing countries. And so if it could make a recommendation and go forward, that would be very helpful. The idea you're going to get, this idea that it's going to be, I don't know if you saw our last thing, which we had Major Jeffrey, what's his name?
Nielsen.
Sort of talk about it. Oh, well, it's going to be whether China or the US does it. That may be who can technologically do something, but we really need the developing countries rising up and say, look, this is just an overwhelming issue. They never should have agreed to 1.5 degrees C. It was far too. They fought for it, I know, and Paris wanted 2, but they should have fought for a lower number if they could have.
Well, that was a great political compromise. That's classic, isn't it, of COP and the IPCC, that you have a deal and it turns out to be a bad deal. Thanks, Mike. For people who don't know, Mike did quite a long interview about SDGs with Nick Breeze, and on his climate, it's called Climate Gen, Climate GENN, podcast series. So if you want to hear Mike talk more about that, that's good. On terms of longevity, I mean, the argument about termination shock and so on, it reminds me a bit of somebody, who's very ill and needs chemotherapy, and they say, if it doesn't work, we're going to take you off it and there's going to be a bad outcome. But, often the person gets better because of it. So this sort of termination shock stuff, and the termination shock stuff also assumes that there won't be radical emissions reduction and there won't be forms of direct cooling. I mean, the point about interventions is that that chart showed, is there the way to keep the system down till other things kick in. So it's not a forever marriage. I think I can only repeat what I said before. I don't think we as a very diverse group of people and interests have clarity about what the strategy is to communicate and convince this. And I think Mike has made a really valuable contribution with that and some of his earlier things. But I think trying to hone down both an understanding of the science and the moral basis, the basis in international law, and the key arguments and refuted key arguments, that would be a really valuable stuff, because my God, there is a lot of, I'm on intervention, science intervention, mailing list, and every month comes in another 50, technical papers. And I just feel, I feel personally overwhelmed by the amount of stuff coming out on the issue. So it's a plea for me. It's a plea for me. It's a plea for me for other people to do what I know needs to be done, but I'm trying to avoid doing.
Yeah, the termination shock issue is so strange because it assumes mitigation won't work.
Yeah.
And yet what they're saying is, well, we're going to do mitigation so we don't have termination shock. And you go, well, hey, if mitigation works, terrific. We'll have small things, but we'll shave off the peak in the interim.
Sorry, Mike. I think the other thing is that and it really caused a shock here. And I did some speaking about this a few years ago. Bjorn Samset did all this stuff about reductions in aerosols, meaning that in the short term, and I mean, 2 decades to 3, that emissions reductions will not turn down the rate of heating. I mean, Jim Hansen said this. He said the loss of aerosols is going to undermine in the short term the effects of mitigation on the temperature trend. And Samset's done a number of papers just basically saying, the temperature is going to be the temperature is likely just continue on the present path. I might go back to point 2 a decade rather than point 3, but I think that people in general are almost entirely ignorant of aerosols, and I think in the NGO and the activist circles and the sort of people who go to COPs and fill a 747 full of people on good salaries who are going to change the world are almost entirely ignorant of the aerosol problem. So I mean that's just another part of the SAI advocacy that we need. That I mean, I think the understanding of the physical system. I mean, last year when I said, look, 1.5 is here, the rate's accelerating. The fossil fuel industry is on the attack. The fossil fuels industry is planning to expand production to 2050. It is possible that there will be practically no emissions reductions between now and 2050 if petrostates and the fossil fuel industry have their way. People said, you're making it up. So I gave them the evidence. I mean, it's clear everywhere that these people are on the attack. And even the UNDP said maybe only 10 to 20% emissions reduction by 2050. So I think there is also underlying this problem of people engaging in SAIs is even amongst activists and professional circles a profound ignorance about the physical system.
Thank you. Right, let's move on to Sev, then Jonathan, and then John Dixon. Sev?
Yeah. Yes. David, have you considered other SRO methods besides SAI at MCB? In particular, I'm talking about ocean brightening, either by nanobubbles or phytoplankton and maybe ice thickening.
I read a lot of this a couple of years ago, and I had a researcher to do a whole lot of stuff on sort of stage of preparation of technologies. Are they developmental? Are they deployable? Are they available at scale? Are they available at a reasonable cost? And the answer then was SAI or nothing, pretty much. So while we wish for all the technological development and other possibilities, I mean, I am somewhat ignorant in this area in terms of the detail, and that's my plea for somebody else to do the thinking for me. Yes, there's all sorts of possibilities, and when the United States developed, had the Manhattan Project, they had parallel development. They had 10 different research teams looking at 10 different ways to build a bomb all at once because time was short, rather than serial development, and that's absolutely important for SAI as well, to have that parallel research opportunity. But I wish for all sorts of great outcomes, but SAI seems to be the only one that is available, fairly simple, at scale and cheap at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay. There's 5 research groups around the world investigating my buoyant flakes idea seriously, and the brightening the surface of the water with long-lived nanobubbles, which lasts for months, is also a good way of having quite a substantial amount of albedo increase over 70% of the Earth's surface.
Well, all speed to you.
Yes. Keep going. Okay, Jonathan Cole. Jonathan?
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to change the conversation just for a second, because part of our purpose for having gatherings is to reinvigorate each other with positive potential. And so if you could locate in your mind the year, maybe it was just before you published the book in 2008 or some other year, where you were the most positive about the prospects of your research and your books, having a positive impact on the direction that the world was going in and where it might end up. And then can you tell us a little bit about that energy that you felt when you were very enthusiastic about the project?
Well, I go by the mantra of the Italian socialist revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, who died in a jail, locked up by fascists, who coined the phrase "optimism of the spirit, pessimism of the intellect." So, that's how I get by. Look, obviously in 2008, when we did a book and said this is an emergency and requires emergency action and mobilization of the war economy, and everybody laughed at us and said it was a ridiculous idea. And I think in 2018, the Oxford Dictionary made climate emergency their word of the year. So that was sweet revenge on all those people who'd pilloried us for 10 years. But honestly, I think the thing that gave me joy was around about 2017, 18, working, as I said, with Ian Dunlop, who's a former very senior fossil fuel executive who'd come over to our mate who's always been outside, and he taught me a lot about risk. And together we wrote a thing called What Lies Beneath: The Underestimation of Existential Climate Risk. And I think it was, I understand from some very senior science in Europe, it had a very big impact because it really put the existential risk argument on the agenda, and it made the case for severe scientific reticence. And that publication would have just wandered along, and it would have had a bit of an impact. But Ian knew John Schellenhuber, who was then the director of the Potsdam Institute and perhaps the most important, significant player in this field in Europe, and he wrote a foreword for us. Where he talks about the quantification fetish and the possibilities, not probabilities. And he said, when it comes to existential risks, quote unquote, conventional scientific research may be useless. It is the most astounding essay in 800 words I've ever read. And so he provided that as a foreword for this book. He just said it all. And that made an incredible difference, because people with ideas but without a voice were amplified by an eminent person, and it really, it got translated into Slovenian and German, and it really then had an impact, and that's why in all this intervention work, it's not just the argument, it's not what you say, it's who says it. And so, that was a very positive experience, because I saw some ideas really, I know some people involved. After that, he and Stefan and others wrote a paper called Existential Risk, something too risky to bet against, in which they said and in that paper they said this is a climate emergency and this is existential risk. And we were told that if we hadn't put that paper, if we hadn't done What Lies Beneath, then that paper would never have come out, and the idea of existential risk may not have sort of got into the mainstream of the science community. So that was a good point. But the point is it's about transmission belts. It's about those credible voices. I don't want to say a new Al Gore, but the intervention debate lacks that royal stamp.
Very interesting. We need an Al Gore for intervention.
Well,
I see where you're coming from. Yeah.
The most obvious man is now 99 or 100 and has done the best nature documentaries in the world, but you need people of that stature.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I did try to convince him of that, including when he did his leadership training one in Australia, and I got absolutely nowhere. In fact, he doesn't call me to be his scientist in meetings anymore, but I keep trying. I keep trying and materials to him.
Yeah, well, closed mind, empty mind.
We'll find another celebrity that could do that. John Dixon, you've been waiting for a long time. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Dennis. That was fascinating, David, and the discussion that follows also. I was sort of struck by some of the elements. So you talked about that we're sitting stuck in business as usual. And in a large measure, that reminds me that we're really got a massive issue of complacency in the face of climate crisis. But Homo sapiens and countries at large often are not very good at dealing with crises. We have a whole long history of public policy failures, of not doing the obvious thing. And part of it is public ignorance, but it also lies to the lack of understanding of many leaders as well. And so we often seem in these situations to oversimplify the real systems that we're dealing with. And the real systems aren't just the climate. The climate is sitting within a whole lot of interacting systems, hydrologic, the carbon too, is sitting alongside hydrologic and a whole lot of other systems. And as Mike said, imagine the billions of people. Well, the billions of people leads me into one of the biggest problems, which is really dealing with the people and the politics. So tipping points came out of actually people, etc., more than biophysical systems. And so I'm really taken by your idea that we need communications subjects and ways of dealing. But I think the bigger questions that we have to avoid the fall back into binary choices, like it's climate or growth, or it's SAI or carbon. We don't have a population that's used to thinking about combinations of options and using that as a means of thinking through risk. And the risk of combinations of options, it's not SAI against carbon. It's what about if we have series of mechanisms that deal both with various aspects of climate, but also various aspects of other crises, including water, including people. And so it's a broader subject where we need additional briefs, I think, to overcome this tendency to fall back to complacency in the face of crisis. So I kind of, I thought that was just excellent. Now, do you, having worked a lot with risk, do you see that as being also an area where we need to educate the public, including our leaders?
Yeah. Look, the reason why we put forward the proposition that you had to think of this as an emergency or as we talked about a whole of society mobilization, which is what the war economy is. It's I mean, in a local way, it's what a response to an LA fires is. The whole of the local state apparatus is turned to deal with a complex set of short-term challenges. When I was a kid and floods, the whole of the local town would turn into one mode, which was to devote everything to a complex set of short-term challenges. The war economy is the same. I think the climate response is the same. There is a complex set of challenges that have to be dealt with as a whole. The market is simply the market cannot put a value on the damages. So the market can't even calculate the risks of climate change. If you look at integrated assessment models and what's going on, I mean, it's now true, and the Exeter people have been saying this, who did the planetary solvency thing, the economic financial models of climate break down at the first point, because you can't put a value on the damage, and you can't quantify the risk. And if you can't do that, then you've got no market, because markets are about the quantification of risk. So I think that argument stands. The other thing that I was just thinking about, that in the things you said to start with, John, is that, I mean, in SAI, I mean, there are people in society whose business is dealing with climate risk. And I think you, or the previous person, mentioned the insurance industry. You can have a better conversation with the insurance industry about risk and where we're going than anybody else, because it's their business. And if they get it wrong, they go broke. So they're not going to be reticent. They're going to be really onto the risk. But I mean, not the only ones. I mean, we're having an interesting battle in Australia at the moment, because the government is supposed to produce 2 climate assessment risks. The first one on the region was produced 2 years ago, and it caused such shock in government that they classified it, never to be released. So we have our first government assessment of climate and security risk, and nobody knows what it is, including the members of parliament. So they can't do their job. And we've got a second one dealing with domestic risk, which is 6 months late. So, I mean, the very discussion about risk causes pain for those in government and bureaucracy. And you know, you talk to people who are doing emergency response management. They're going, oh, God, I mean, what you're saying, David, is different from what we're hearing from the IPCC. I mean, what do we do? Because I'm going, what's the plausible worst case scenario? And they're going, no, we haven't really thought about that. So, I mean, I think there are elements in the state and in the bureaucracy and in the insurance industry and the risk industry who day by day are feeling the pain of dealing with this, and therefore they're a good starting point.
Okay, thank you, David. Let me move to Ron, who hasn't had a chance to ask a question, and then I'll go back to Greg for a second round. Ron, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dennis. I hope people can hear me. I can barely hear you, but and I have my video off because I'm putting my ear right up against the screen. I didn't want you to have to look at my ear. Anyway, thank you so much, David. And I really apologize. I thought I would come, find a nice quiet cafe, and I ended up here. But so I have just two quick points. One is, David, when we were talking, I mentioned Jeffrey Nielsen, and is a proponent within the U.S. military establishment of looking at climate change as the global existential risk, not as one of many risks, but as the major risk. He's trying to convince his folks of that, and that led us to, he's very much in that world of nations trying to exercise geopolitical power, and it's so. The broad question here, and Mike and I have had this discussion, others, many of us have had this, is it altruism or self-interest? What's ultimately gonna make this happen? And I think, we are, of course, always in support of altruism. We want to get people on board as much as possible, but the other avenue would be for countries to ally themselves with great powers or with a strategic geopolitical goal of, if you don't want billions of refugees, if you don't want a food crisis, if you don't want all these other things that are not going to be solved through fascism, building walls and, having people, drown in the Caribbean and so forth, you need to deal with it, in a more proactive way. Yeah. So that's one point. The other one is we have as you may know, we have been advocating that the International Maritime Organization just temporarily relax its stringent, recently more stringent
sulfate rules.
Control on sulfates. And we have had recently just a little bit of success. We were able to finally contact the UK permanent ambassador, and she has passed this on to higher folks in the government to see how they should respond. We've also contacted one of the lead scientists in the IMO, who basically encouraged us to do that, to try and find a nation or an NGO with standing to get this submitted to the Marine Environment Protection Committee of the IMO, of which she is the Heike Dugan is the chair. That's the IMO scientist that we have been in contact with. But so my appeal to the many Australians here, including you, David, is we have Rebecca Bishop has actually been, and I know Robert Tulip as well, trying to contact officials in the Australian government to similarly ask that our letter, it's an open letter published in Oxford Open Climate Change, past peer review and everything, that be submitted to that committee, that the representative of Australia similarly ask the IMO to take that up, to put that on the agenda. So whatever people can do, we've made a similar appeal to everybody in the UK. The US, of course, is hopeless, but anybody in any country, almost every country has a representative to the IMO, and all of them have standing, and they could ask that this be put on the agenda. So that's just a very practical thing. It's not going to save us, but it could reduce cooling quite quickly by anywhere from 0.1 to 1. I mean, the estimates are all over the place, but it is significant, and it would have a significant impact right away. So that's my second point.
Thanks, Ron. I mean, I think there is increasing understanding in WA, in maritime organisation and associated circles, that it's been a bit of an own goal. I mean, I think that's now understood now. I mean, the problem is that sulfates are the basis of acid rain, and acid rain kill a lot of people. So it's tricky territory. I mean, I used to joke in a black sort of way, and people said, we've got to close down these dirtiest coal-fired power stations in Australia. And I ironically would say, well, I think you should close down all the clean ones and keep the dirtiest one open, because we don't want to burn the coal, but we need the sulfates. And that's the sort of, and that's, it was tongue in cheek, but I mean, there is a serious problem here.
Yeah.
There's a really serious problem, and I agree. On the security issue, I've done a lot of work with security leaders in Australia, and I mean, the Chatham House report, the 2021 climate assessment, is essentially a climate and security risk assessment. And that's a brilliant example of how you can bring climate and security together. I mean, sad to say, particularly in this era of Trump-driven geopolitical instability, this is about self-interest. When I go out and talk and say to people at 3 degrees, here's what's going to happen, half the world is going to be unlivable and markets will collapse, I'm not trying to appeal to people's altruism. I'm just going to say the global economy on which your business depends will collapse. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
David, can I just quick follow up? So we're having to relax in the high seas, and there's actually studies saying that if you just relax in the high seas and keep the regulations in populated areas, the effect on health is substantially, significantly diminished. So it actually does. Yeah. And the other one is and this is a more general point, but when the Great Depression, the global democracies got together along with Stalin, but the democracies came up to the plate. Is it going to be fascism or democracy that's going to, save the world from this economic crisis? And the democracies finally stepped up to the plate. And I think, Jeffrey is trying to similarly make the case that, if the U.S. and the democratic powers, it's hard to call the U.S. democratic right now, but hopefully we will go back to that in the future, that do not step up in the plate, it's highly likely that more authoritarian regimes like China will lead the charge. Because and the question is whether the democracy, with their such short-term time horizon of the politicians, can do this. I mean, we did it, in World War II, but can we do it again? And I think it's a serious question.
Well, it's a question about what's a democracy these days. Particularly in the United States. I mean, obviously, in climate and in many other things, I mean, the two keys are the EU and China. I think they're the key to this.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that, but I will. Yeah, I'll have to stop because I just can't hear. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No, David said the two keys are the EU and China. And with that, let me go to Hugo, who hasn't had a chance to have a question yet, and then wind up with Greg. Hugo?
Yes. Hi, David. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Hugo Hendrickson. I'm the CEO of Positive Polar. I'm a founder of a science expedition cruise company that will spread nutrients meanwhile sailing, and also building advocacy within our passengers of all of this that we are talking. That's the goal of our company. I'm based in between USA and Chile, so we are in winter, just like you, I think. So that's why I have this. And just I want to congratulate you for your presentation, but also I would like to if you allow me to also I was a staff officer of the Chilean Navy. I was in the War Academy, and we did this study all of this about the climate change, how the security can be affected.
Yep.
And one of the most important things that some countries has, I did saw your map, very good, around the equator, but some countries like the ones that depends on the glaciers that are in the mountains that provide them with water are one of the most affected. I'm talking about countries like obviously Chile, obviously the west of California, right? Obviously all the Alps, Switzerland, that you can see the news there. So that is, and also the Golan Heights, right? That's why Israel is so always so careful of keep control of Golan Heights, right? So that kind of things I will add you to the map, because our countries that are more like close to us, but and that could be create a more impact, right? Because if you show only this desert Sahara, no one lives there. But if you show that is other places, could your tale that is excellent, I said, could create more impact. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Hugo. I mean, yes, I wasn't doing a whole presentation on 3 degrees and the food and water crisis. I would have gone to that. I mean, I just showed the heat maps as one example.
Yeah.
I've got a whole 50 slide set on food and water and glaciers and the maps about water shortage. I mean, and it's in India, it's in Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is one of the most affected. In India, the overuse of bore water has meant the water table is dropping, and India is going to have an incredible water crisis. In Pakistan, where they draw most of their water off melt flow from the Himalayas, because it doesn't rain much in Pakistan itself, they've got a dual problem of, in the end, less melt water, but also it's changing, and rivers that didn't used to flood are, and ones that didn't are now, and so yes, there's another whole world which I didn't talk about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And we're just about out of time at the 1.5 hour level, but Greg, if you have something very short, we can take that before we close.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to keep it quick. A couple points really quick. The whole discussion about educating people about risk. One aspect maybe is the misuse of the distribution functions. And
Yes.
This was brought up by the financial guy, Nassim Taleb, who talked about the black swans, where you're ignoring the fat tails. So it could be a theoretical problem which happened in the markets, where all these guys are modeling wrong distribution functions and underestimating the risk of long tail events. I just bring that up as a possible component of the miseducation. The other thing I wanted to say is that if we don't blow it so badly that our societies are incapable of reacting, that our societies become destabilized, which I think there is a risk of the ability to act on large scale becomes more and more challenging as societies crumble within. But if we don't screw up that way, then I see an age of cooling beginning, which I'm an unapologetic advocate for starting things with SAI, and I know there's disagreement about that, but I think that's the way to go. Just boot it up. But as soon as the dam busts on this wall against any cooling, then money will pour into everything. SEVs, bubbles, and everybody's stuff will start getting it, and there will be this age of innovation around cooling. That's serious, because we're not really innovating here on cooling. I mean, there's pockets, but we're not getting enough money to innovate. But once SAI itself will be heavily innovated. So the SAI we're talking about now is not going to be used a few years after it is initiated. So the SAI will be continuously innovated, and also all these other programs, all these other technologies will come in, and they will begin to take the burden away from SAI. So this will address the issue of ever more sulfur until you're putting up hundreds of tons per year to keep up with the reheating, but that won't happen. But it takes the boot up of an age of cooling, and I still think that the SAI will be the driver, the initial driver. And then it will be increasingly supplemented and offloaded to these other ones. So anyway, that's one.
Yeah, agreed.
David?
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting vision for us to ponder on as we close the seminar today. We're right at the 1.5 hour mark. I would just like to bid to you, David, to stay with us in our endeavors, both to understand the problems and to take action. And as I mentioned, we're doing some very interesting things with a whole range of countries and a whole range of organizations now on developing a coalition of climate vulnerable countries that could come together and could champion a new climate plan based on the triad. So we're taking action, and your wonderful intellect is something that we would value being with us as we take that journey. So let's stay in touch, David.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. Great conversation.